All right, I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Close that other tab. Put down your snack. Because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most unbelievable, infuriating, and ultimately satisfying stories I have ever come across. And by the time we reach the end of this video, I promise you, your jaw is going to be on the floor. Not once, not twice, but at least 3 separate times. This is a story about a car. A single, solitary car, parked in a man's own driveway, on his own property, that he owns. And somehow, a group of 7 people in a neighborhood committee decided that this was their personal crisis. That this one car was such an offense to their sensibilities, such an affront to everything they believed in, that they were willing to spend months harassing one homeowner, issuing illegal fines, making threats, and abusing every shred of power they thought they had just to get rid of it. What they didn't count on was that the owner of that car wasn't just going to roll over and take it. No, he was going to document everything, study everything, build a legal case so airtight it would make a lawyer blush. And then in one single glorious neighborhood meeting, he was going to burn the entire HOA board to the ground. Metaphorically, unfortunately, but almost as satisfying. Stick with me, because this one has twists and layers and a subplot involving a forged document that is genuinely one of the most brazen things I've ever heard of. By the end of this story, you're not going to believe that real people, adults with jobs and families, and presumably some self-awareness, actually behave this way. But they did, and it's all documented. Let's go back to the beginning. His name was Marcus. Marcus Del Rey, 41 years old, mechanical engineer by trade, which is important, really deeply important, because the meticulous, analytical, detail-oriented way his brain worked is essentially the reason this story ends the way it does. Marcus wasn't the kind of guy who got emotional in arguments. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't send nasty emails at midnight fueled by spite and 3 glasses of wine. No, Marcus was the kind of guy who, when wronged, sat down quietly, opened a spreadsheet, and started building a case. The kind of guy who read the fine print. All of it, even the boring parts. Especially the boring parts. Marcus had moved into the Pinecrest Reserve neighborhood. That's what we're calling it. Not the real name, but trust me, these neighborhoods all look the same about 4 years before any of this started. It was a nice community. Newer build, maybe 8 to 10 years old at the time. Good schools nearby, quiet streets, decent neighbors on either side of him. He had a modest but well-kept house, a small vegetable garden in the backyard that he was irrationally proud of, and a single-car garage that had, over time, become more of a workshop than a parking space. Because Marcus liked to tinker. And that tinkering hobby is how all of this started. About 18 months before the conflict truly erupted, Marcus bought a car. Not just any car. A 1972 Chevrolet Nova. Now, if you know your cars, you're already smiling. If you don't, picture a wide, low-slung American muscle car from an era when people didn't care about fuel efficiency and everything was chrome and attitude. This Nova was a project car, meaning it was not in perfect condition when Marcus bought it. It needed work. Body work, mechanical work, interior work. It was, if we're being honest, a little rough around the edges. Some surface rust, a faded red paint job that had seen better decades, mismatched hubcaps, and a crack in the passenger side mirror. But to Marcus, it was a diamond in the rough. His weekends, his therapy, his passion project. He parked it in his driveway, right next to his daily driver, a very normal, very clean, very boring silver Toyota Camry. And he started working on it little by little, weekend by weekend. He'd be out there Saturday mornings with his coffee, lying under the thing, radio playing, completely in his element. Neighbors walked by, some waved, some stopped to chat. A couple of the older guys on the street actually got into it with him, talking carburetors and horsepower. It was a whole thing, a good thing. And then the letters started. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in February. Marcus came home from work, grabbed his mail, and there was a crisp white envelope with the Pinecrest Reserve HOA logo in the top left corner. A little gold emblem. Very official. Very serious. Inside was a 1-page notice informing Marcus that his vehicle, described in the letter as an unsightly and inoperable vehicle, was in violation of Section 4, paragraph C of the HOA's governing documents, which stated that no vehicle in a state of disrepair may be parked in a resident's driveway if visible from a street. Marcus read that letter 3 times. Then he looked out his front window at the Nova, then back at the letter, and his first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Because the car wasn't inoperable, he drove it occasionally, not far, just around the block to keep the engine turning over. And yes, it wasn't finished, but inoperable? That was a stretch. A big one. He set the letter down, made himself a sandwich, and decided he'd look into it. No big deal. Probably a misunderstanding. He was wrong. It was a very big deal. And it was very much not a misunderstanding. The HOA board of Pinecrest Reserve was, at the time, chaired by a woman named Diane. And here's where I need to give you some context, because Diane is, and I say this with the full weight of the word, a character. Diane had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. She'd been on the HOA board for 9 of them and board chair for 4. She ran those board meetings like a courtroom, had opinions about everything, gutter colors, holiday decoration timelines. The precise shade of beige a fence could be before it was considered off-white, and therefore a violation. And she had what can only be described as a gift for conflict. If there wasn't drama, she would find it. If she couldn't find it, she'd create it. She was the kind of person who smiled while delivering bad news, and somehow that made it so much worse. Diane lived 3 houses down from Marcus. She could see the Nova from her front window. And according to a neighbor who later came forward with receipts, actual receipts, Diane had been complaining about that car at board meetings for months before the first letter was even sent. She described it as an eyesore, a property value risk, and, I am not making this up, the kind of thing that attracts a certain element. Whatever that meant. Whatever she thought that meant. The rest of the board, to varying degrees, went along with her. There were 6 other members. Rick, who mostly agreed with everything Diane said because they were friends. Linda, who was newer to the board and clearly uncomfortable but didn't push back. 2 guys named Tom and Gerald who didn't say much either way, but nodded a lot. A younger woman named Priya, who had joined the board because she genuinely wanted to help the community and was slowly realizing she'd made a terrible mistake. And a guy named Carl who, frankly, didn't know what he'd signed up for, and looked quietly exhausted at every meeting. That was the board. Those are the people who decided to go to war with Marcus and his project car. Marcus's response to the first letter was measured. He wrote back, professionally and promptly, explaining that the vehicle was neither inoperable nor in a state of disrepair. It was a restoration project, it was registered and insured, it ran, and he was actively working on it. He included a copy of the vehicle registration and insurance as proof. Polite. Documented. Done. He figured that would be the end of it. 6 days later, he got a second letter. This one acknowledged his response, but stated that the HOA board had reviewed the situation and maintained their position. The car, in their assessment, still constituted a violation based on its overall appearance and condition relative to neighborhood aesthetic standards. There was also a new addition to this letter, a fine, $150, due within 30 days. Now Marcus was annoyed. He went back to the governing documents, all 87 pages of them. And here's the thing about HOA governing documents. They're often written in the most bureaucratically vague language imaginable, full of subjective terms like aesthetically appropriate and reasonable standards that boards love because it gives them wiggle room, but which also, when examined carefully, can become their own undoing. Marcus read every single word of Section 4. He made notes. He highlighted things. He cross-referenced paragraphs. And he found something interesting. Section 4, paragraph C, the rule they were citing, applied specifically to vehicles that were inoperable as defined by state motor vehicle law. He checked the state's actual legal definition of an inoperable vehicle. In his state, a vehicle is legally inoperable only if it lacks a valid registration, valid insurance, is missing major mechanical components that prevent it from being driven, or has been officially condemned by law enforcement. His Nova had registration. It had insurance. It ran. A police officer had never declared it inoperable. By the state's own legal definition, it did not qualify, which meant the HOA citation was based on a misapplication of their own rule. Marcus typed up a 7-paragraph response, cited the exact state statute, cited the exact HOA rule, and laid out clearly and calmly why the fine was invalid and how the board had misinterpreted their own governing documents. He sent it certified mail. He kept a copy of everything. Diane received that letter, and according to someone who was in the room when she read it, she put it down on the table and said very quietly, "Oh, we got a fighter." She said it like it was a challenge, like she was pleased. That should have been Marcus's warning sign right there. The next 2 months were what Marcus would later describe as the calm before the storm. He didn't hear much from the HOA directly, but things were quietly happening. Neighbors mentioned to him that Diane had been going door to door, like it was a political campaign, talking to other residents about the car, framing it as a neighborhood issue, a property values issue. She was collecting, she claimed, community concerns about the situation. Marcus heard about this secondhand and honestly kind of laughed. He thought it was overdramatic. He didn't realize she was building a file, because Diane wasn't just canvassing. She was looking for allies. And she found a few, because in any neighborhood, there's always a handful of people who, when approached by someone with authority and conviction, will nod and say, "Yes, I suppose that is a concern," even if they never actually thought about it before. Diane had 3 or 4 people sign a little informal petition. Nothing binding, nothing legally meaningful, but she was going to use it as a prop. In April, Marcus received a notice that the HOA board would be holding a special hearing regarding his vehicle at the upcoming monthly meeting. He was invited to attend and present his case. He marked it in his calendar with a small yellow star. He started preparing. Now, this is where I need to stop and tell you about Marcus's neighbor, Eddie. Eddie lived directly across the street. Semi-retired electrician, early 60s, sharp as a tack, and absolutely, completely done with HOA nonsense after a previous incident involving his mailbox, that we don't have time to get into right now, but which apparently still made him fume 2 years later. Eddie hated Diane with a quiet, steady, long-burning kind of hatred, the kind that doesn't explode but just radiates. When he heard about the hearing, he knocked on Marcus's door that same night. "You know what she's going to do," Eddie said, standing in the doorway with his arms folded and a look on his face like a man who has seen things. "I think I have a good case," Marcus said. "I'm sure you do," Eddie replied. "But she doesn't care about your case. She cares about winning. She's going to bring people. She's going to have her little stack of papers. And when you get up there and start talking, she's going to interrupt you. That's her move. She interrupts you, throws you off, makes you look flustered, and then she controls the narrative." Marcus thought about that. Then he asked, "Do you want to come with me?" Eddie smiled for the first time all evening. "I thought you'd never ask." Marcus spent 3 weeks preparing for that board meeting. He wasn't going in there to argue or yell or make a scene. He was going in there like a lawyer presenting to a jury. He organized a full binder, color-coded, tabbed, everything, with the state statute definition of an inoperable vehicle, a copy of his registration, proof of insurance, photographs of the car showing it was intact and drivable, a printed record of every letter he'd sent and received, and this was the move, printouts of his state's HOA law, specifically the sections regarding the proper process for issuing fines, the homeowner's right to dispute, and the binding nature of the governing documents on the board itself. He also did something that, at the time, seemed like a small thing but turned out to be enormous. He found the HOA's previous meeting minutes, which, by law, had to be made available to residents, and he read every single one going back 2 years. And buried in there, 16 months prior, was a reference to a board vote to update and amend certain sections of the governing documents, including Section 4. There were no actual amended documents attached to the minutes, just a reference to the vote happening. Marcus made a note, circled it, put a little question mark next to it. The night of the meeting arrived. It was a Wednesday in late April. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a room that smelled permanently of carpet cleaner and old coffee, with folding tables arranged in a U-shape for the board and metal chairs in rows for residents. About 25 people showed up, which was more than usual. Word had gotten around. People knew something was happening. Some of them genuinely wanted to hear the situation. Some of them were just there because small-town drama is entertainment and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Marcus and Eddie sat in the second row, Marcus's binder on his lap, both of them quiet and composed. Diane sat at the center of the board table, flanked by Rick and Linda, the others spread out on either side. She was dressed impeccably, like she prepared for this too. She had her own folder. She glanced at Marcus when he walked in, gave him the smallest, coldest smile, and went back to arranging her papers. The meeting opened. Routine stuff first. Budget update, landscaping report, someone's fence needed repainting. Standard. Then Diane said, with great ceremony, and now, we'd like to address the ongoing situation at 447 Birchwood Drive, Marcus's address, which has been brought to the board's attention as a community concern. She laid out the board's position. The car was unsightly. Residents were concerned. Property values could be impacted. The board had issued a citation and fine in accordance with the governing documents. The homeowner had responded, but the board maintained its position. Then she did something unexpected. She produced her petition. Held it up. I'd also like to share that 7 residents have formally expressed concerns about this situation in writing. She set on the table like she was dropping a verdict. Marcus felt Eddie shift slightly in the seat beside him. He stayed still. Mr. Del Rey, Diane said, looking at him with practiced civility, we've given you the opportunity to speak. Would you like to address the board? Marcus stood up, took a breath, opened his binder. He started with the state statute. Calmly, clearly, defined inoperable vehicle exactly as the law defined it. Explained that his vehicle met none of those criteria. Noted that the HOA's governing documents explicitly tied their definition to the state statute. Therefore, he said, with all due respect, the citation and the fine were based on a misapplication of the rule. Diane tried to interrupt twice. Both times Marcus held up one hand, just one hand, very calmly, and said, I'll have that addressed in just a moment, thank you, and kept going. Eddie, watching from his chair, visibly tried not to grin. Then Marcus got to the fine. He explained that under the state's HOA laws, a fine could only be levied after a formal notice of violation, a reasonable cure period, and a hearing. He noted that the board had skipped the cure period. They'd issued the fine with only 6 days between letters, when state law required 30. Therefore, the fine was procedurally invalid regardless of whether the underlying citation was valid. You could see some of the board members shifting in their chairs. Priya had her head slightly tilted. Carl was staring at the table, but he was where Marcus paused. He let a beat go by. Then he said, slowly and carefully, I also want to raise one additional item. I was reviewing the board's meeting minutes from 16 months ago, and I see a reference to an amendment vote on Section 4 of the governing documents. I submitted a public records request to obtain the amended document. However, another pause. No amended document was ever filed with the county, as required by the State HOA Act for any governing document amendment to be legally enforceable. Which means, as of today, the amendment doesn't legally exist. And the version of Section 4 I've been citing this entire time is still the official, legally binding version. I have the county property records right here. He pulled the page, held it up, put it back down. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. Diane's expression had not changed. Not visibly, but her jaw was slightly tighter than it had been a minute ago. Rick was looking at her. Linda was looking at her hands. Carl let out a breath, so slowly it was basically a sigh. The board will review this information, Diane said, still smooth, still controlled. That's all I'm asking, Marcus said, and he sat down. Eddie leaned over and very quietly said, nice. If that had been the end of it, this would be a nice, satisfying story about a man who did his homework and won a dispute. But it was not the end of it, because Diane did not take losing, and that meeting had clearly gone in Marcus's favor, lightly. And this is where the story takes a turn that I genuinely did not see coming when I first heard it, and I don't think Marcus did either. 3 weeks after the meeting, Marcus received another letter. This one was different. This one wasn't about Section 4. It was about Section 7, Paragraph B, of a rule Marcus had never been cited for before. Section 7, Paragraph B governed accessory structures and temporary installations, and the letter claimed that Marcus's use of his driveway as an ongoing automotive workshop, tools visible, tarps occasionally covering portions of the vehicle, work performed over extended periods, constituted a quasi-commercial home operation and violated the residential use covenant. Marcus read that letter and felt something he hadn't felt before in this whole process. Not fear, not anger, but a cold, creeping recognition that Diane wasn't playing by any rule book. She was just going to keep throwing things until something stuck. She had more pages than he did, and she was willing to burn through all of them. He called a lawyer, not to hire them immediately. He couldn't afford a full retainer, but to have an initial consultation, which he paid for out of pocket. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia who specialized in property and HOA law, looked over everything he brought her and told him 3 things. First, he was right about everything he'd argued so far. Second, the new citation was a reach, but HOAs had used vaguer language than that to win before, so it wasn't nothing. Third, and most importantly, she said, has your HOA been selectively enforcing their rules? Because if they've been ignoring similar situations with other residents and specifically targeting you, that's discriminatory enforcement, and it completely undermines their ability to fine you for anything. Marcus had not thought about selective enforcement, not in those terms. But as he drove home, he started thinking about it. He started thinking about other people on the street. He started thinking about Phil, 2 houses over, who had a boat on a trailer in his driveway, practically year-round. He started thinking about the Garcias, who had a camper van that was definitely not the cleanest thing in the world. He started thinking about, and this was the big one, Rick's garage. Rick was on the HOA board. Rick's house had an attached garage with the door perpetually half open, and inside that garage, as Marcus knew from walking past it on his evening runs, was a riding lawnmower for snowblowers, various equipment, and what appeared to be either an old ATV or a very unfortunate go-kart in various states of disassembly. Marcus had never thought anything of it. People had stuff. It was normal. But now he was thinking about it differently. He was thinking about it like a mechanical engineer building a case. He started documenting. Every morning and evening for the next 3 weeks, Marcus took a walk. Friendly, casual, normal-looking walk. He had his phone. He took photographs. Public-facing, visible from the street, completely legal to photograph. He documented Phil's boat, the Garcia's camper, 3 other driveways that had, at various points, cars he'd seen residents working on. He photographed Rick's garage through the open door from the public sidewalk. He noted dates, times, put it all in a folder, made a second binder, and then, and I want you to really appreciate this, he submitted a formal public records request to the HOA for every violation letter the board had issued in the previous 3 years. Under his state's HOA transparency laws, they were required to provide this. They had to. They had 30 days to respond. They were not happy about it. According to Priya, who would later, quietly and off the record, become something of an inside source for Marcus, Diane's reaction to the records request was, and I'm paraphrasing here, absolutely volcanic. Not because they had anything to hide, she initially insisted to the board, but because it was a signal. Marcus wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was investigating them. The records came back 26 days later, and they were illuminating. In 3 years, the HOA board had issued 41 violation letters to residents. Of those 41, 33 out of 41 had been issued to the same 5 residents. Marcus ran those addresses against a mental map of the neighborhood. For the 5 addresses, residents who had, at various points, had public disputes with Diane, not with the HOA as an institution, with Diane personally. The 5th address was a rental property, which boards universally use as a citation dumping ground. And in those same 3 years, Phil had received 0 violation letters about his boat. The Garcias, 0. Rick, board member Rick, driveway workshop Rick, 0. Not once. Marcus had his selective enforcement case. Now here's the subplot I promised you. The one involving the forged document. Because around the same time, something happened that, honestly, when Marcus told this part, I had to stop and just stare for a minute. About 5 weeks after the first HOA meeting, Marcus was talking to Priya. She reached out to him, carefully, nervously, by text, and said she needed to tell him something. They met at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, 2 towns over, like they were doing something illegal, which says everything you need to know about the atmosphere on that HOA board. Priya told him that at an internal board meeting, a closed meeting, which residents weren't invited to, Diane had produced what she described as the updated Section 4 document. The one from the amendment vote 16 months ago. The one Marcus had established hadn't been filed with the county. Diane had presented it at this closed meeting, said she had located a copy, and proposed that the board vote to reaffirm their enforcement position based on this document. But here's the thing Priya noticed. She'd been at the original amendment meeting 16 months ago. She remembered it vaguely. And the document Diane showed at this recent closed meeting, the formatting was slightly different. One clause that Priya distinctly remembered being discussed and removed during the amendment process was back in the document. Back in with a different font. A slightly different font. The same typeface, but one size larger in that specific paragraph. Like someone had typed new text into an old document and it hadn't quite matched. Priya had said nothing in the meeting. She was scared. She was new to the board and she didn't fully understand what she was looking at, and she didn't want to accuse Diane of something that's serious without being certain. But she kept a photograph of the document on her phone. She'd taken it under the pretense of wanting to review it later. And that photograph was what she showed Marcus at the coffee shop. Marcus looked at it for a long time. He's an engineer. He notices things. He looked at the font. He looked at the paragraph. He looked at the surrounding text. And he said, "Can you send me this?" Priya sent it to him. He spent 2 evenings analyzing it. And then, because he didn't fully trust his own non-expert assessment, he sent it to a friend who worked in forensic document analysis. Not officially, not as a case, just as a favor. "Hey, look at this and tell me what you think." 3 days later, his friend called him and said, and this is the quote Marcus relayed, "I can't say for absolute certain without the original physical document, but based on what I can see in this image, there are strong indicators of post-creation alteration. The font metrics in that paragraph are inconsistent with the surrounding text, and the paragraph spacing is off by about half a line. If this went to a court, it would raise serious questions. Serious questions about a document that Diane had presented to her own board as the basis for ongoing enforcement action against Marcus. A document that didn't exist at the county. A document with characteristics consistent with having been altered. Marcus sat with this information for a week. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately fire off an email. He thought about it strategically, because what he held right now wasn't just a defense against the HOA. It was potentially something much bigger, and he needed to decide how to use it and when. He went back to Patricia, the lawyer. He told her about the document. She listened, asked a few sharp questions, and then said something Marcus would think about for a long time afterward. If that document is what it appears to be, you're not just dealing with an overzealous board chair. You're dealing with fraud. And fraud against an HOA, which is technically a nonprofit corporation in your state, is a very serious thing. The question is, do you want to end this quietly, or do you want to end this completely? Marcus thought about that drive home. He thought about every letter, every fine, every walk Diane had taken door to door, try to turn his neighbors against him. He thought about how much time he'd spent on this, how much energy, how much of his weekends that could have gone as Nova had instead gone to binders and records requests. He thought about the other 4 residents who'd been repeatedly cited. He thought about Priya, sitting across from him in that coffee shop, nervous and clearly not sleeping well. He said, quietly, out loud, to nobody in particular, completely. The annual HOA general meeting was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday of June. Every resident in Pinecrest Reserve was invited. It was the one meeting where full attendance was possible, where issues could be raised from the floor, and where, crucially, the board members could be voted on, voted off, or challenged publicly by the community. Marcus had been to one of these before. They were usually dull. Landscaping budget. Election of officers. Someone always complained about the speed bumps. This one was going to be different. Marcus spent 3 weeks preparing. He prepared the way he imagined a prosecutor prepares for trial. He built a presentation, a clean, simple, printed handout that he planned to distribute to every resident who walked through the door. One page, front and back. It had 3 sections. The first section summarized his personal situation: the car, the citations, his responses, the procedural violations by the board, the selective enforcement data. The second section showed the violation records from the last 3 years, the addresses, the patterns, and the comparison to unreported violations by board members and their associates. The third section, and this he discussed very carefully with Patricia, did not outright accuse anyone of document fraud. It simply noted that questions had been raised regarding the authenticity of a governing document amendment, stated that the amendment had never been filed with the county as required by law, and stated that a formal inquiry had been initiated with the state HOA oversight authority. That last part was true. On Patricia's advice, Marcus had filed a complaint with his state's HOA regulatory body 2 weeks before the meeting. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A formal complaint. The kind that gets investigated. The kind that goes on record. The night before the meeting, Eddie came over. They sat on Marcus's front porch, and Eddie looked at the Nova sitting in the driveway, glowing faintly silver in the porch light, and said, "You know, for all the trouble that car's caused you, she's looking pretty good." And she was. Marcus had been making real progress. New paint, a deep, rich midnight blue, almost perfect. New chrome trim. The interior was next. She was getting there. "She's worth it," Marcus said. Eddie nodded slowly. "Yeah, she is." The June general meeting had 38 residents in attendance, the most Marcus had ever seen. Word had traveled in that way that word travels in neighborhoods. Not officially, not loudly, but person to person, over back fences and in the parking lot of the grocery store. People knew something was happening. Diane opened the meeting exactly as she always did. Marcus watched her scan the room, count heads, register the number. He saw the slight stiffening in her posture. She knew the number wasn't normal. Marcus had positioned himself near the side of the room, close to the door, near a small table where he'd placed a stack of his handouts. Not on every chair. He didn't want to be dramatic about it. He let people take them if they wanted. The meeting moved through its early agenda. Budget reports. Pool maintenance. Somebody complained about dog waste near the North Trail, and that took 8 minutes because apparently it always does. And then Diane said, her voice carrying its usual executive authority, moving on to new business. The board would like to provide an update on the ongoing enforcement situation at 447 Birchwood Drive and invite the community to. Point of order. It was Eddie, standing up, completely calm, arms at his sides. Before the board presents their update, I believe Mr. Delray has requested floor time to address the community. Under Section 12 of the governing documents, which I have right here, any resident in good standing may request floor time at a general meeting to address matters affecting the community. Mr. Delray made that request in writing 10 days ago. Was it received? Diane looked at Rick. Rick looked at his papers. The answer was yes, it had been received, and there was no legal way to deny it. Linda confirmed it quietly. Diane smiled, still that cold, controlled smile, and said, "Mr. Delray has the floor." Marcus stood up. He picked up his handouts, passed them to Eddie, who started walking them down the rows. Not forcefully, gently. For anyone who'd like a summary, Marcus said, in a pleasant, even tone. And then he talked for 11 minutes. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't use inflammatory language. He presented facts, dates, documents. He read the state statute definition of an inoperable vehicle. He displayed, on a portable projector he'd brought from home, which he'd quietly set up during the landscaping discussion, his color-coded violation records chart, showing the pattern of selective enforcement. He noted the procedural violations in the fine issuance. He noted the county records showing no amendment had been filed. And at the end, he said, quietly but with total clarity, that he had filed a formal complaint with the state HOA oversight authority, that the complaint was currently under review, and that any subsequent enforcement actions against him, or indeed any other resident, while those matters were under review, would potentially constitute retaliation, which was explicitly prohibited under state law. He sat down. The room was so quiet that somewhere in the back, someone's phone buzzed and half the room heard it. Diane's response was measured. She disputed several of his characterizations. She maintained that the board had acted in the best interest of the community. She said the records request had been responded to in full and that any patterns Mr. Del Rey was reading into the data were his own interpretation. But the room had read the handout, and then something happened that nobody, maybe not even Marcus, had fully predicted. Priya leaned forward at the board table and said, "I'd like to make a statement as a board member." Diane looked at her. "I have concerns," Priya said. She spoke carefully, like someone who had rehearsed this, who had sat alone in their car and talked through it out loud. "About the way this situation has been handled, and about," she paused just slightly, "certain documents that have been presented to the board recently. I think these concerns warrant a proper independent review before any further enforcement actions are taken. I'm formally requesting that we pause all ongoing violations related to this matter pending that review, and I'm asking for a vote." Rick shook his head. Gerald looked at the ceiling. But Carl, exhausted, done quietly over all of this, Carl raised his hand and said, "I'll second that." It passed 4-3. Linda had voted with Priya and Carl. The enforcement action was paused. "On the record, voted." Diane said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "The vote is noted." And she moved on to the next agenda item like nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew something had happened. People were whispering, turning to each other, looking at the handout. Marcus sat very still, his binder on his lap, and let out a long, slow breath. Eddie leaned over and said, and this was exactly the kind of thing Eddie would say, "Told you to bring the handouts, didn't I?" "You absolutely did," Marcus said. The aftermath unfolded over the following 3 months. It was more complete than Marcus had honestly expected. The state HOA Oversight Authority completed its preliminary review 6 weeks after the general meeting and sent a formal inquiry letter to the Pinecrest Reserve Board, specifically requesting documentation relating to the Section 4 amendment vote, the original amendment document, and all enforcement actions taken in the preceding 3 years. They also, notably, requested the specific document that Priya had photographed. That document, the one with the inconsistent font. They wanted it. Diane resigned from the board 5 days after that letter arrived. There was no announcement, no statement, no farewell. One morning, she was on the board. The next morning, there was an email from the HOA management company saying that the board chairperson position was currently vacant and that an emergency election would be held at the next meeting. Just like that, 12 years in the community, 9 years on the board. First chair, gone in 5 days. Rick resigned 2 weeks later. No official reason given. The investigation by the Oversight Authority concluded with a formal finding that the HOA had engaged in procedurally improper enforcement actions and that the amendment documentation for Section 4 had significant irregularities. They stopped short, publicly, officially, of using the word fraud, but they did refer the matter to the County District Attorney's Office for further review. That review was still ongoing the last time Marcus provided an update. All fines issued to Marcus. The $150 and a subsequent $200 fine he hadn't even mentioned yet were formally voided, in writing, by the management company on behalf of the remaining board. He never paid a single dollar. The remaining board, now with Priya as acting chair, sent letters to the 4 other residents who had been disproportionately cited over the previous 3 years. The letters apologized, carefully worded legal apologies, but apologies nonetheless, and voided several of those fines as well. Phil's boat is still in his driveway. Nobody cares. And Marcus? Marcus finished his Nova. Midnight blue, chrome trim that catches the light like a mirror. Rebuilt engine, new interior, every detail exactly right. He drove it to a local classic car show in August, just a small regional thing, and won second place in his class. He has the little ribbon on his garage wall now, right above the workbench where he keeps his tools. The Nova sits in the driveway when the weather's nice. He drives it on weekends. The neighbors, the ones who live there now, who know the story, who remember, sometimes wave when he goes by. Some of them stop to admire it when he's washing it on a Saturday. Even a couple of people who had signed Diane's informal petition came by at some point to, in their way, acknowledge that they'd maybe been nudged into it by someone with an agenda. Eddie still comes over sometimes. They drink coffee on the porch and talk about the car and don't talk about the HOA. There's not much left to say about the HOA. Now I want to take a minute here, before we wrap this up, because I think there are things about this story that go beyond just the satisfaction of watching someone win. And believe me, the satisfaction is real. I hope you felt it. What Marcus did, and what makes his story different from most HOA horror stories, because trust me, there are many and most of them end badly, was that he never let it become about emotion. He stayed analytical. He did his homework. He understood that the most powerful thing you can have in any kind of institutional conflict is documentation. Not passion, not outrage. Documentation. A paper trail so thorough that the other side can't wiggle out from under it. He also understood timing. He didn't deploy his strongest information immediately. He built his case patiently, strategically, and he chose the right moment. The annual meeting in front of as many witnesses as possible to present it. He didn't go to social media. He didn't make phone calls to local news. He didn't do anything that could be characterized as inflammatory. He just presented facts to the right people at the right time. And the facts, by themselves, were explosive enough. There's also something to be said about Priya. She's the unsung hero of this story in a lot of ways. She was scared. She didn't have to do what she did. She could have kept her head down, voted with Diane's block, and avoided all of it. But she didn't. She chose to do the right thing even when it was uncomfortable and risky, and that vote, that one formal procedural vote at the general meeting, was the pivot point. Without it, Marcus might have had a strong legal case, but a much longer, more expensive fight. With it, the board's internal unity cracked, and once it cracked, the whole structure came down. And there's something about Eddie, too. About having one person who's been through something similar, who knows the terrain, who shows up at your door the night before the big meeting and sits with you on the porch. You don't win these things alone. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought it too. You're thinking, what about the document? What happens with that? And honestly, as of the last update on this story, that's still being determined. The DA's office review is not a fast process. It might not result in a formal charge. It might. Document fraud is a serious thing. And if it's proven that a governing document was deliberately altered and presented as authentic to influence a board vote and an enforcement action against a resident, that's not a civil matter. That's criminal. But the wheels of that particular process turn slowly, and Marcus has decided, wisely, I think, to let it turn without him standing over it pushing. He's already won everything he needed to win. The car stays. The fines are gone. The people who came after him are gone. And every time he pulls out of the driveway on a Saturday morning in that midnight blue Nova, engine grumbling, chrome catching the sun, he wins again. Quietly. Completely. Every time. Before we close, I want to say one last thing. Because HOA stories, and I know we've all seen them, we've all heard them, some of you have lived them, they often get told as black and white narratives. Evil board versus hapless homeowner. And sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes you get a Diane. Sometimes you get a board that has genuinely lost the plot and started to believe that their role gives them more authority than it does, more power than the law allows, more right to tell grown adults what they can do on their own property than any reasonable person would accept. But the answer, the real, useful, practical answer, isn't to rage at them. It isn't to escalate emotionally. It's to know the rules better than they do. Read your governing documents. Know your state's HOA laws. Because HOAs derive their power entirely from legal structures, and those same legal structures contain the tools to check them, challenge them, and when necessary, dismantle them. The power is there. Most people just never pick it up. Marcus picked it up, and he turned a bureaucratic nightmare about a project car into, honestly, one of the most satisfying examples of a regular person using the system correctly that I have ever come across. He kept the car. He won the case. He fixed the car. He went to a car show. He got a ribbon. And somewhere in a house 3 doors down, there's a vacancy where a very specific kind of person used to live. And the street is, I'm told, a much nicer place for it. That's it. That's the story. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you genuinely for writing this out with me, because I know that was a lot. But I hope you feel like every minute was worth it. I know I did. Hit that like button if you want more stories like this. Drop in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me your HOA story because I know you have one and I want to hear it. And subscribe if you haven't already because we've got more coming. Bigger, messy, more complicated, more satisfying. The next one? Oh, the next one is going to make this look tame. I'll see you there.